Currently, we're seeing diplomatic and military mess unfolding in Afghanistan, with the Taliban pretty much overrun more than two-thirds of the country, and Kabul is pretty much threatened, and it seems the momentum is on their side. And while it's not impossible, but it's nearly unlikely that the Afghan government would be able to resist the onslaught of the Taliban. What's, what I'd like to discuss today is, could any of the things that are unfolding now, and could the experience of America in Afghanistan, could it have been predicted in the pages of Sun Tzu's Art of War? I very much believe so. Many of the things that are unfolding is clearly you're warned about these things that you shouldn't do to avoid um, that sort of calamity that we see unfolding right now. Um, when we think about Sun Tzu's book, we think about it of some sort of treaty on war, but in essence, it's actually more intellectual, and it focuses more on how we should think about waging war, and how we should think when making decisions concerning the affairs of the state and the affairs of war. It's not a definitive treatise on, okay, what sort of tactics I should use in battle or to win battles, or, but it's an overall. I don't even think it's so much an overall strategy per se of waging war, but it's more of a treatise on how to make decisions connected to strategy, how to make decisions connected to waging war, how to think about the people who wage war, how to think about the environment in which you wage war. So it gives you, a framework to make decisions on waging war. So for that very reason, I think the people who listen to those words and who understand the value in those words will make the right decisions, and will succeed. For example, I mean, one of the things Sun Tzu talks about is the value of the terrain, the commander, I mean, who leads the troops. He talks about method and discipline. I mean, most of us are very familiar with, basically the five factors that he talks about. He talks about the moral law, you know, um, he talks about heaven and earth, So, I mean, we could just, run through briefly again what these refer to. I mean, as I said, most people I'm sure are familiar with the text now these days. I mean, every mom, dad, and son and daughter probably has, in some way, heard about Sun Tzu's Art of War, or have read it themselves, or has been exposed to it, because now it's even used in the annals of business, some sort of strategic approach when making decisions connected to business. Well, let's go over these five factors again, and let's look at who has the advantage. Um, well, let's start with the commander. Well, uh, based on what we're seeing, and based on what is unfolding, we definitely realize that there's definitely not enough strictness and discipline with the commander of the Afghan forces, because these guys have surrendered without a fight. Most of them have given up without a fight. So there's a lot of questions concerning the commanders. Obviously, it seems like the commanders with the Taliban are more organized, more disciplined, because, and there's obviously more strictness and rewards. So in that respect, it seems like right there the Taliban has the advantage when it comes to the commanders. Um, if we look at the terrain, again, the terrain is inhospitable. It's difficult. The Taliban again had mostly rural terrain, which is generally more difficult to deal with and to traverse and to attack or to try to flush them out in any way. So from that perspective, they may seem to have a little more advantage, and but I believe that the Afghan themselves should in some way be familiar with their own terrain. So I mean, there might be just a slight advantage for the Taliban. As I said, the rural terrain would probably be more harsh than the cities, so it might be easier for them to conceal themselves and organize themselves, and then rain down on the provincial capitals and stuff like that. So that is understandable. They might have the advantage on of the terrain. Then again, they've had a lot of experience in dealing with that. I mean, in their fight with the Soviets, And so the commanders, that knowledge might have been passed on. Whereas, remember, the Afghan army is relatively new in terms of coordination and training, and relatively new in terms of being built up, and the familiarization probably with the the machines of war. And we have to understand also in that perspective, there's a different strategy with the Taliban. The Taliban strategy seems to be a hit and run strategy. It's very difficult to defend against a sort of guerrilla strategy that is being, waged by the Taliban. The Afghan forces might have been more trained for a conventional type of confrontational approach to war, whereas the Taliban seems to be a hit and run and opportunistic, which actually Sun Tzu in the pages of the Art of War highly recommends that you attack what is weak and you tend to avoid what is strong. So I mean, just to me, it seems like the Taliban is taking that sort of approach and attacking the smaller towns where there's less resistance, and consolidating their forces until probably they might have some sort of final push for Kabul, which might be a little more heavily defended. So there we have, I said, the commanders. The favor seems to be on the side of the Taliban. Um, Now, if we look at, let's say, the moral law is critical, and the moral law is not, cliche in terms of moral values and stuff like that, but it's more how much the people are in accordance with the will of their sovereign or leader, and how united they are, how much values they share in common. And that is critical, because if we understand fundamentally, the Taliban is made up of the Pashtun tribes, and that is another thing that we need to look into in when we try to understand perspectives on Afghanistan. We need to understand the ethnic makeup of the country. And the Pashtun people, I think, is at least 40% makeup, and generally they are the ones that make up the bulk of the Taliban. So there's a common shared moral value and system. I mean, they have the tribal Pashtunwali values, which in some cases are coincident with Islam, and most of them are Muslims. So it's easier to have that fabric, intertwined fabric of understanding and common value system. Whereas the Afghan army, the Americans might have tried to integrate many different tribes to create some sort of national army, which by itself, because of the difference in ethnicity and culture, may prove a little difficult. It's not an easy task. So the moral law definitely is on the side of the Taliban, and there seem to be a unison of action and understanding of objectives. So far, we basically have three things, 3 out of 5. So just based on those 3 out of 5, the Taliban already has the advantage, and based on Sun Tzu's teachings, you will see that they would be able to have the advantage in war, just based on those 3 out of 5 values. Then, if we talk about method and discipline, again, if you look at the coordination and just looking at the way the Taliban forces operate, based on what we're seeing, their marches, there seem to be a level of organization and coordination that is not seen in the Afghan army. Again, that could be tied into the concept of there's a fundamental understanding, among the Taliban, that hey, this is clear objectives, this is what we want, and this is what we're gonna do. Whereas the Afghan soldiers may, in some way, be have a different mentality and may think that hey, you know what? I guess we're just working for our salaries. We're trying to make some money for our family. They may not have the same objectives that the Taliban fighters may have, and they may not have the same understanding that the Taliban fighters may have. So again, when you talk about that sort of dedication to their job, there might be some sort of question as to who is more dedicated. So again, and that front, the Taliban seems to have the advantage, you know, with the method of approach to waging war and the discipline. Well, we usually refer to them as extremists, so that in itself can tell you the level of extreme discipline and order and structure that they may have in their forces. Whereas, because things are a little different, and the Afghan army may have been modeled more Western forces, where troops may feel yes, they have to take command, but there's a little leeway, and understanding. Whereas with the Taliban forces, I'm sure because of the extreme nature of their doctrine, there must be absolute command structure and absolute discipline. So again, the method and discipline, again, that's another 4 to 5, on the side of the Taliban. So all we're left with is the heaven and earth, which we probably could say it's equal, for both forces, in terms of measurements and distance and stuff like that. I think they're all familiar with the distances to engage each other and stuff like that, and they're all familiar with the weather and stuff like that. So I think all in all, 4 to 5. That's really not good for the Afghan army, and the Taliban, hands down, have a lot of advantage. Again, we have to see how things unfold in the next couple of weeks, and it does not mean that Kabul will be overrun. There is a possibility of a last stand, and we just got to take a look and see what happens. Based on the control and the capture of certain parts of the country that the Taliban has had, it seems to be like they've captured the northwest. They've captured some places in the west. They've also captured some places in the south. So it seems to me that the idea, which would be very difficult to stand off and concentrate your force against, it seemed to me if they were to make some sort of final push for Kabul, they will push their forces from the north, they'll push their forces from the west, and they'll push their forces from the south, and have some sort of coordinated 3-prong approach to the battle. And if you're in Kabul and you're surrounded like that, there's really it's going to be very difficult to defend against that 3-prong approach. So again, not impossible if there's some sort of reinforcement, some sort of help with air power. But again, I don't think there's the appetite among the American people and the American leadership for more war in Afghanistan. And they may get a lot of flack for withdrawing, but possibly it might be the time to cut their losses and move on, because as even in the pages of Sun Tzu's Art of War, it specifically talks about prolonged campaign, and he actually he's adamant about not engaging in prolonged campaign. And this has been a 20-year campaign, and the problem is that if you do analysis of what is being gained, how much ground is being gained, how much are they changed in the hearts and minds of the people. So yes, there might be some sort of flack for moving out at this time, but probably it's best to do it at this time, and instead of pumping more resources into a situation that you're really not getting your bang for your buck. You're not, So I think in the wisdom of their understanding and judgment, the American leadership must have said, we've had it. This is enough. We're fighting a losing battle. And again, even Sun Tzu talks about that. He says you must have an idea or some sort of see a way to win before you even wage a war. And probably that might have not been calculated when the American forces decided to go into Kabul. Again, we have to look at the history of a place, even where we're engaging in war with individuals or groups or nations. Before you even embark on a campaign, you got to look at the history. of the person or group of people that you're dealing with. I mean, if you look at the history of Afghanistan, it's a very, very, very difficult place to control. It was shown with the British. I mean, the British had a very difficult time. I mean, their first attempt, they gained some ground, but they were eventually overrun and slaughtered. I mean, everybody's might be familiar with the story where one doctor was left to tell the story. When he went back to Jalalabad on horseback, and he was the only one that escaped the slaughter. You can look into that. I mean, it's there's history on that. So then the British tried again a few years after, had some successes to try to redeem themselves, but still ultimately it didn't work out. They had to leave Afghanistan. Then we have the not too distant past. We have the story of the Soviets in Afghanistan. I mean, the Soviets tried to prop up a communist government, and that didn't work too well. Then the Soviet invaded in 1979, had a prolonged, protracted war for 10 years, 79 to 89. I mean, almost more than 500,000 Afghanis died and perished during that war. Still, the will of the people were not broken. And in particular, in that war, it seems like, I mean, there was a better sense of collaboration and unity among the Mujahideen soldiers who ultimately, in 1989, the then USSR had to pack their tanks up and leave Afghanistan. And of course, at that time, I mean, the Mujahideen was supported by the Pakistanis and, of course, American money and support, military hardware and stuff. So, but the lessons were, was there. The lesson was that, okay, the British tried, the Soviets tried, and then it's kind of hard to understand why NATO and the US thought that in some way that they would be able to make a difference. Again, history is a testament to the present and to the future, and we see what's happening. Hopefully, there's a lot of prayers for the Afghan people themselves, the civilian population, who unfortunately bears the brunt of the hard end of the stick in any war. So hopefully, the Taliban themselves could have learned from their mistakes and could keep the interests of the Afghan people themselves at heart. And I believe, that's just my humble opinion, that they may somehow would temper their actions, and it will be foolish if they didn't, seeing what happened and try to have some sort of different approach to things. But let's see what happens. All is not lost. They have not won. Again, it's obvious the momentum on their side, but more importantly, as I said, it just testifies of how Sun Tzu's treatise on how to think about war is so clear, so real, so correct, so spot on. To see that everything that is happening there could have been predicted. And like with many other wars that has taken place, one could see in the pages of Sun Tzu what happens. So probably it should be some sort of required reading for leaders or military leaders or politicians, because ultimately politicians make the decisions as to whether or not we go to war or not, and the military puts into effect their orders. But so probably politicians should have some sort of understanding of how to think about war. And a lot of problems that we see, a lot of carnage, a lot of waste of money, a lot of waste of lives, sadly, can be averted if one understands. I mean, Sun Tzu talks about it specifically. He says one should know when to fight and when not to fight. I mean, he talks about how much you'll win in battle. He even talks about knowing thyself. And, so these are some of the things that he's very clear on. And, we probably could have some follow-up conversations as to what you think. We'll see how this unfolds. Please feel free to give your opinion. If you have a different idea as to, the reasons things unfolded the way they have, please educate us. This is, I'm all open for discussions, and this is basically our discussions and opinions. And again, please feel free to make your comments, and let's see what happens in a few weeks, a few months from now.